I gotta tell you, the meeting's being recorded. That's funny. Some legal thing. Okay, so this is now the fourth session or the last of this kind of prolegomena that I felt needed to be done in order to talk about the direction of what I believe theology needs to move to in this turning. And we are at a turning of the ages, literally at a turning of the ages. And this is what we're talking about today. So I don't need to tell you that the world right now is in an incredible state of flux. You just have to look at geopolitical issues, economic issues, social crises, revolutions. You can look at the rise of dictatorships and populism around the planet the last 5, 6, 7 years. I mean, there are so many things happening that, and we only just get these bare snippets in whatever news source we're reading. We don't get the deep structure stuff about what's happening. That stuff is kept from us. But for those that have an eye, a historian's eye, it's actually much easier to see when you understand that you're dealing with things that have already happened before. And before that. And before that. And you can see patterns. And so modern historians will talk about cycles of history or historical cycles. Repetitive historical cycles that just come and go and come and go. You know, the phrase history repeats itself. Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain said that history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And this is the case. So if you want to know where we're at today, it's helpful to know where we've been, because you can't know where you are until you know where you've been. And so it's the students of history that are able to make the most sense out of the current crisis. And because we have not experienced the kind of crisis we're in now in our lifetime, except those that might have been younger adults in the 60s. But the majority of us were teenagers or we were around then. We haven't experienced this kind of a crisis. So it's brand new to any number of generations. But the crisis we're going through now, each time we go through a major crisis, a major historical cycle, the cycle, as it were, gets stronger and stronger. And so the prosperity part of the cycle is always bigger. And the utopian part of that cycle is always bigger. And then the crash is always bigger. And we're headed for a crash of historic proportions. And we truly do live at the beginning of very apocalyptic times. Part of the reason I can say that is that history is like a sine wave. It moves up and down with regularity. And so we, in the 2020s, are at the end of a number of these historical cycles that are all colliding at the same time. And you can see the same thing if you go to the end of the fall of Rome, which the final was 529 under Justinian. You can see it again in the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire. Hang on, I gotta let Tim in. There we go. You can see it again in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and World War I, the collapse of the British and German empires in World War II, the collapse of the Soviet Empire at the end of the Cold War. It was the first time that we did not have a hot war to end everything, but we had a Cold War. And then now the war on terror, this never-ending war. The part of our problem in America is that we have not for over 100 years existed with a peacetime economy. We have always been on a war footing, and war belongs with money. And we're going to see this over and over again in the talk today when we talk about the history of Israel, when we talk about Jesus and the cleansing of the temple, and then we'll come to our own time. But history repeats itself. Now, you've seen a human heartbeat. It's that repetitive pattern, okay? It's the same thing in human psychology. You can apply human psychology to the markets. And if you have what's called a wave theory of the markets, you can see where the waves are going to come crashing together in the best time to make a trade. But you can also see the same thing in actual brain waves. Everything in reality is some kind of a wave. Everything. This is also true on the quantum level. Mimetic theory observes that human history goes in cycles of crisis and scapegoating. And the last great scapegoat, as it were, global scapegoat, was Hitler. And remember, scapegoats aren't necessarily innocent. They're just the one where everybody agrees that was the problem. And since that time, the scapegoat mechanism and sacrificial practices have broken down. We see, of course, all of this in the demise of religion, the rise of fundamentalism, and these sorts of things. And we're heading toward another time where we're looking at a major scapegoat, one way or another. The world is. It's possible America could become the next scapegoat. That is, the world will just disavow America and her empire. It's possible corporations could become the scapegoat. It's possible China could become the scapegoat. It's possible some particular leader that decides to launch a bunch of nukes could be a scapegoat. I mean, anybody can be a scapegoat. That's what I'm saying. And there are just these cycles. So at the end of the talk, I'm going to talk about some of the cycles that are ending right now. But I want you to observe that. But the church also goes through cycles, and theology goes through cycles. And Phyllis Tickle observed that the church history changes about every 500 years. So you have the establishment of the church in the 1st century, and what happens in the 6th century, the fall of Rome. And the church now moving into a completely different realm in what we would call the early, well, it's late antiquity, the early Middle Ages. And you really don't, there are things that are going on, but it's not like it was before until Charlemagne in 800 and the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, moving up to the Renaissance, down to the collapse at the time of the Reformation. Oh, I forgot, around the year 1000, you had all the millenarian movements and poverty and famine and everything else all happening there around 1000. The Reformation, which was a time of great social change. The Reformation wasn't about religion, okay? Luther's a pivotal figure in the Reformation, and because he's a theologian, we think it's about religion. But the Reformation was primarily social and economic. I mean, there was a big change at the time. And we can see the same thing happening at the time of the Reformation that we see happening everywhere when I'll talk about slave revolts later. And that's the Peasant War of 1525. And it was Luther's reaction to that war, justifying the princes taking on the peasants and killing them, that would help be a spark that would produce the Anabaptist movement and the move to nonviolence in those communities. And then, of course, we have the end of the 200-year move into the next part of the cycle with the French and the American revolutions. And now we're at the end of this whole cycle, this 500-year cycle in church history, and Christianity is once again going to change. And so theology will change. So we really do live at this remarkable moment in time. It's totally unique. It's a little scary, and it's also a lot of fun, kind of like a roller coaster, okay? Now, when we look through the lens of mimetic theory and we talk about the origins of the human being, there's a couple of things that are going to develop out of religion, which is the mother of culture. So, oh, Keith wants in. So religion is the mother of culture, but with religion, there are two things that are going to go hand in hand. The first is hierarchy, and the second is slaves. especially in the development of early human populations, to take members of other tribes on as slaves, and often to use them in human sacrifice. But when you deal with written history, say from Homer, Hesiod forward in the West, not so much talking about Homer and Hesiod, but at least written history, or the Jews in the East, you will find two things: kings and peoples, and hierarchy and revolt, over and over and over again. The slave revolts in the years leading up to the Roman Republic were enormous and frequent, and the same in Greece. I mean, it's kind of tough if you're the master and you have 5,000 slaves and a security force of 20 guys that run around on horses threatening people, and they all decide at once to jump the fence, and it's all over with. So nobody wants a slave revolt. But with slave revolts, there's always economic disparity and the problem of usury. Now, again, I'm going to be tying all of this together. But you need to know that when it comes to what we call money, the standard myth is that humans began with barter, and then they needed something in common they could use as a medium of exchange, like seashells and this and that and the other. And then eventually we got to coinage. And then credit and debt. It's actually the other way around. The earliest records we have that come from ancient Sumer and ancient Babylon are credit records. People did their accounting with records, record keeping. That is, they did it digitally. Okay, so for those people that are freaking out about the new digital dollars that are coming, just understand the human species started this way. So credit comes first, then eventually coinage. And with credit comes usury. And so if you're a landowner and you are asked to lend money to another farmer, and that farmer can't pay it, you take their land. Now they're tenant farmers. Now they're really not able to make a living, so they're not able to pay their taxes, so they borrow more, so you take their daughter and you get to have her for so many years, and this and that and the other. It's little wonder that people revolted. It's little wonder that we move constantly from revolution through stability, and a new hierarchy emerges that the bottom revolts against, and establishes another hierarchy, and the bottom revolts again. And we end up in the middle of the song by The Who that we won't get fooled again. But it's meet the new boss, same as the old boss, every single time. Because we are sinful. And I don't want to introduce the category of sin yet in the prolegomena here, but that's just a basic tenet that I work with in my anthropology. So take the case of Israel. It begins as a slave revolt. It moves to a savior figure in Moses. This is really irritating. I'm sorry, guys. I've got to kill my internet here because it keeps sending me trading signals, and it's just absolutely annoying to me. Okay, sorry about that. Moves to Moses, who's a lawgiver, who brings order and stability to society. And then in the cycle, so you've got slave revolt up to Moses, who's the top of the mountain. And then you're going to slide right back down into anarchy and Judges. And what comes at the end of the book of Judges? Everybody was doing right in their own eyes. In other words, everybody was saying, I am a law unto myself. I am my own law. You with me on this so far? It's total anarchy, isn't it? Okay. Then you move from Judges back to a savior figure on the way up. It's going to be Saul, but it's really David. And then you move straight down from the you have the establishment of the kingship and the temple tied together here, and you move straight on down through David's family line into exile. Then you have the move, and at this point in exile, you have all the prophets denouncing the religious government mix in the temple and the ungodly inequality that existed between those who had and those who had not. Then you move back up the line to the Hasmonean Revolution or the Maccabean Revolution, and you have the establishment of a kingship in Israel, and you've got to drop it all the way back down to the major crash of 70 CE and the destruction of the temple. Jesus' death comes 30 years before that cycle ends. Okay, and then there's that's it. Judaism is then shoved aside in world history until the 20th century, in a sense. They don't have a homeland or a temple. And again, through all of this, you see the same exact phenomenon everywhere. A hierarchy that uses the population, the labor force, in order to enrich itself, and justifying it through the use of religion, over and over and over and over again. So part of the criticism of the Catholic Church at the time of the Reformation was that the Catholic Church was enriching itself at the expense of the people. And it would do this, for example, wanted to raise money to build St. Peter's, the Vatican. And so in order to raise money to do that, it said, well, you know, you've got so many of your family members in purgatory, and if you'll come and pay some money and have a mass said for them, why, we can get them out of purgatory quicker. So of course, if you love your family, you're going to be taking all your coins to church and trying to get your family out of purgatory quicker, and you're hoping like hell your kids will do the same for you. You know what I mean? And so you had that famous saying of Johann Tetzel, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Bam. I mean, these guys were as good as any modern charismatic TV preacher. You know, they all know how to do the same thing. They all know how to get your money. So this happens over and over and over again in this cycle, and we can see it even happening in the cycle of Jesus stories. When he goes to the temple and he shuts down both the sacrificial system, the religious system. He makes a whip to drive the animals out because they're not going to move. They're scared in their pens. He's getting them out of their pens. He's setting them free to run through the temple. Get out of there. But he's also destroying the banking system there, the money changers' tables, because economic debt and religious debt in Jesus' teaching are the same thing. And freedom from debt, forgiveness, is the same thing. So you have this cycle that just continues throughout history. We, of course, have it today. There's no surprise there. And when we come to our own time, postmodernity, at the end of any cycle, what happens is the question about the mythology gets raised. So at the end of the Greek ruling cycle, it's the early philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle that begin, and Epicurus and others, that begin questioning the mythology, okay? Just as later Christians would question the Roman mythology, just as the reformers would question the Holy Roman Empire Catholic Church mythology. And so before there's a collapse, there's always a challenge to the mythology. The Soviet Union experienced it. Leninism and Stalinism was a failure. Khrushchevism, or however far you want to take it, Brezhnevism, that whole plot of an attempt to make Marx a social state plan in the Soviet Union failed. Life was miserable. And you had a hierarchy. You still do. America is at the end of her time because her myth has been questioned. We see this, for example, in Howard Zinn's book, History of the People from Below. But all of this stems from the Holocaust and the knowledge that the Holocaust brought to the West. Because for the first time, the entire Western Christian tradition had to deal with the fact that a Christian nation was exterminating the Jewish people. And once those camps were liberated, and once it was discovered and filmed, everybody knew then. Nobody could hide from it. You can't hide from it. The data was just there. It was real. It was human. And it's this victimage awareness that Nietzsche foretold 70 years before this would be the downfall of Christian civilization. Because in victim awareness now, what happens is, at first, the West is immensely guilty over these victims, which is why shortly after the war, the Brits make this large error, and they literally take the land from the homeowners of the land and give it to the Jewish state. And then the Jewish state has to fight for it. We know this is the nation of Israel. But this awareness of victimage that Nietzsche talked about, he said that there's going to come a time when everybody's a victim. And when everybody's a victim, nobody's a persecutor. You with me on this? But still everybody's a victim. And we can see this today. I mean, I have to laugh. I'm sorry, I have to laugh when a former president of the US claims he's being victimized, or he's the object of a witch hunt. You know, I don't think that particular person would make a very good scapegoat at all. It's going to take somebody far more heinous than that. But this approach to the victim has a prior beginning, and it has, in a sense, an anti-beginning. You see, you can't have victims without persecutors. There have to be real persecutors. And when you look then at the history of the church and you move back far enough, you will find the first figure that will defend and make an argument that the church not only has the right, but the obligation to persecute. And this is St. Augustine. He's the first theorist of the Inquisition. This is going back to just past 400 CE. And he will make the case that the church has an obligation because it's better to get somebody to confess to Christ under torture than it is for them to not confess Christ and burn in hell forever. Now, this is amazing. It's absolutely amazing that this logic makes its way into the Christian tradition. But remember, Augustine was a Manichaeist to begin with, a complete dualist. And he's totally separated everything into two spheres. So what happened in this sphere? Not so important as what happens in this one. Augustine is also the first figure in the West to write a first-person singular book. I, Augustine, I'm going to tell you my confession. It will take 1,500 years before this I of Augustine, the self-conscious literary I, will become the linchpin of everything since then, for and including for us. And that's with Descartes, who establishes the I on ability to think. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And that thinking process for Descartes was I can doubt. I can doubt that I exist, and the very fact that I can doubt everything, even my own existence, proves that I think, and therefore it's my thinking that gives me existence. And thus the rise of rationality and the Enlightenment, but also the rise of the category or the concept of the individual. And when you have the rise of the individual, you're moving away from tribe, clan, this and this, that, and the other. You have the individual. Now you have groups and guilds and churches. You see you have alternative societies. But as this I concept develops through the next 300 years post Descartes, it requires a social contract. Because I've got Tommy and I got Lynn and Derek and Andy and Ruth and everybody else in this room, and we're all going to live together as separate, independent, autonomous egos. Well, we have to have a way of getting along together. So we create a social contract, which is nothing other than a Torah, a set of rules and laws by which we will regulate ourselves. And this is why the entirety of the Western judicial tradition in the last 300 years has become so unmanageable and so unwieldy, and why courts anymore are unable to really decide anything because of the serious amount of all kinds of case law that's out there that has come from all kinds of circumstances. It's a legal hoarder nightmare out there in the judicial world today. But we also have in our own mythology the American as individual, the American cowboy, the frontier person that goes across America to find, new treasures and create land and homestead. And we have a number of again, tied all in with this is the quest for money and war with the Native Americans. And then as we're moving west, then we also will divide as a nation north and south between New England money and Southern plantation money, and who has the right to the money. And the thing here is we move to the end of a long 100-year cycle, and had in the 1890s a major depression. I don't know if you're familiar with this. I was not until I read a book called Politics, Reform, and Expansion on the 1890s and everything that went with it. I will tell you now that as I've been reading this book for the last several days, I'm absolutely stunned by the parallels that existed in that decade and our own time. But it's from the depression of the 1890s and the inability of the government to solve its financial crisis that would end up producing the Federal Reserve in 1913, and then, of course, a currency shift. And what do you have? World War I. Then we move through the crisis in the 20th century of the Versailles Treaty, Germany's inability to pay, the establishment of a war machine in Germany, World War II, the demise of the British pound, the establishment of the US dollar as the reserve currency in 1944. Move on to the end of the next cycle. America's at war with Vietnam, but it can't fund the war because it's on a gold standard. It needs a lot more money. And if you're on a gold standard, you just can't print money. So what does Nixon do? Takes the US off the gold standard. And then we lose the war. But Reagan used that to his advantage, or our advantage, and proceeded to run up all manner of debt to outspend the Soviet Union and thus win the Cold War. We're now at the end of a cycle where the US dollar is at the end of it's at a 50-year cycle. This August 15th, it'll be 50 years old, and currencies just don't last this long. We're also now seeing a run-up in the news with regard to United States opinion on China. First of all, we're seeing a rise in violent attacks on Asian Americans in the United States. That's number one. That to me is a social signal. But number two, it's been exacerbated now by the recent flip-flops of both Dr. Fauci and the Biden administration with regard to whether the COVID flu came from the lab or from the marketplace, you know, and I mean, you had the WHO in there and they came to no firm conclusions, but there may or may not be evidence, but it doesn't really matter because what we're seeing also in the last 2 days are the US and China trade representatives, and the US trade representative came out and said, we are no longer in engagement with China, we're in competition. There's your mimetic rivalry now. It's starting. So everything is in play right now here to try and make China the bad guy. Remember, this is the same China we've been buying cheap goods from for decades and loving it, right? How much stuff do you have in your house that says made in China, right? So we are in this cycle, and at the end of each of these cycles also comes intellectual distrust. So at the end of the first cycle that we talked about, we have the rise of monasticism, and at the end of the next cycle, we have the ignorance of the clergy and the rise of universities. At the end of the next cycle, we also see tremendous ignorance on the part of the mob and the Ivy League schools being established in America. I'm thinking of the French Revolution, the US Revolution. Where we're at now at this period of time is we are at the end of an intellectual cycle. That is, it's run its course. I will take this cycle back to the beginning of the 20th century with the establishment of the discipline of linguistics under Ferdinand de Saussure. And it was de Saussure that established the two levels of language: speech, parole, and langue, the structure of language. And from the deep structure of language and speech, they're two different things. And of course, when you hear structure, you should think structuralism. Yep, comes from de Saussure. When you think Derrida, yep, comes from de Saussure. When you think Paul Ricoeur, definitely, again, influenced by this distinction. Our hermeneutical dilemma came as a result of the fruit of a hermeneutics of suspicion, that we can't trust words. I mean, in the century before, Feuerbach, Marx, Nietzsche, the younger Freud, and then de Saussure in the second decade of the 20th century, starting his work. We are at the end of an intellectual cycle there at the beginning of the 20th century. The next intellectual cycle begins after the World War. And that intellectual cycle will produce an incredible war machinery, aeroplanes, automobiles. I mean, think about the production of the automobile from just by Henry Ford just prior to the turn of the century, 1900, up through World War I. And then look what happens from World War I to World War II with the automobile, the tank, the bomber. I mean, it's amazing, this leap that occurs. We've seen the same thing from World War II through our own era into technology. I had wanted to observe that the church too is at the end of her intellectual history right now. It's the end of the historical critical method as the dominant method of exegesis, and has been probably for about 30 years, with all manner of other methodologies attempting to usurp it. and sadly, we are currently in what I call a space that I call the theology of the genitive. So just take the noun theology and put an adjective on it, or put it in the genitive. Liberation theology, Black theology, Latino theology, Latina theology, feminist theology, you name it, you put the adjective on it, and we have multiplied the so-called perspectives of the way we do theology ad infinitum. And then we have the groups within each of these fighting each other for ideological supremacy. You see it in the feminists, you see it in the LGBTQs, you see it in the Black and womanist communities, you see it everywhere. But the thing is, we have all these theologies of the genitive, all competing for airtime, all demanding to be heard, that is, they have a voice. And in all of this, there still is no gospel. Because the I, from Descartes through Kant, through Heidegger, into the modern era, the postmodern nihilistic era, the I is everything. My voice counts. The ego is everything. And so we are literally going to live through the destruction of the category of the ego, which has already been underway in the human sciences now for over 70 years. First of all, it was done, used to be, we used to think in terms of faculty psychology. The person's made of parts, and we just have to treat the parts. Now we don't do that anymore. We don't treat people as eyes. We treat people as part of systems. So when a person comes in for therapy, the therapist isn't analyzing their dreams unless they're still Freudian. They're looking at systems theory and asking about the family system and the role one plays in these kinds of social questions. The subject has been deconstructed in literature. I mean, in modern film or modern novels, your heroes are either very black and white, the good guy's the good guy, the bad guy's the bad guy, or you have anti-heroes, or you have films where it's impossible to root for almost anybody. You're just kind of grinning and bearing it. But you see this destruction of the category of the I, or the character, in all of this. We're at the end of that cycle. We will learn how to be human again as community, recognizing, as René Girard says, that we are interdividual. This, I think, and we'll be delving into this down the road, but I need to mention it here, is where the church will end up. Because the church is not a group of individuals involved in a social contract. The church is a group of people related to each other by desire for Jesus as Lord. That's the church. He is our common desire. We still will imitate each other's desires. But like Paul will say, follow me as I follow Christ. Think on the things that are good, he says in Philippians. We will imitate each other's positive desires rather than be in a community that imitates each other's negative desires. And thus, whenever you have a community that has negative desires being imitated, you have to bring in the law. You have to. And the church has made its mistake at every single turn when it does that. And what happens then is the law comes in, people will submit to it for a while, and then there will be rebellion against the law. Because the law is used by those in hierarchy to hold on to power. It always happens that way. Nothing changes. And if you know history, you can be assured that there is another side to this thing that's coming to us. There is whole hell of a lot that we have to go through this next decade to get to the other side. But there is another side. I'm not preaching some doom and gloom rapture event, end of the world, Jesus is coming back nonsense. But I am saying these are truly apocalyptic times. And apocalyptic times reveal. That's what the Greek term apocalypse means. It means to reveal. And what is being revealed is us, who we are as a species, our inability to govern ourselves, and our need for one king that we can all follow and whose desires we imitate and who we know and who we trust. All right, I will stop there.